Welcome everybody to Peter White Public Library. And my name's Marty Acketts, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator here. You all probably know that already, but I think I'm under contract and obligated to say that every time. But I'm really excited for Jean's presentation tonight. Just going to make you aware of a few things that are up and coming for the next week or so. I won't go through the whole month because there's a lot. But next week in particular, there's some really good concerts that are coming up. We have Michael Waite on Monday at 7 p.m. out on the concert on the steps. On Tuesday, we have the Harry South Quartet. So that's going to be a jazz quartet on Tuesday on the steps. And then on Wednesday, we have the Goofy Foot Band, who's going to be here. And if you don't know the Goofy Foot Band, I didn't until they introduced themselves and they sent me some music, but they describe their music as rockabilly music with a punk rock heartbeat. Actually, if you don't like punk rock, think of it as rockabilly, and if you like punk rock and don't like rockabilly, then just think of it as punk rock. But it's really good. Their music is really good. And we have all kinds of other really great events coming up. There's brochures over there right by the door if you want to find out what's happening in August. And if you're interested in September, I'm working on that right now. So hopefully we'll have that information out and you can take that home with you soon. Okay, so let me just do a little introduction here for Jean. Do I call you Dean Millhiser or do I just say Jean? Dean Jean, there we go. Gene Millhiser earned his BA with high distinction and Juris Doctor degrees from the University of Michigan. He later earned a Master of Laws degree from the Judge Advocate General School in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he was the first honor graduate in his class and thereafter taught for a 3-year appointment. In 2001, Dean Emeritus Millhiser joined the Ave Maria Law School of Law faculty upon retiring as an Army Judge Advocate after 21 years of service. In May of 2006, he was appointed Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and in April of 2009, he was appointed Acting President and Dean of the Law School. In January of 2010, Gene was appointed to the law school's second president and dean, and he stepped down in July of 2014 and rejoined the faculty as a full-time professor, teaching mainly in the areas of criminal law and criminal procedure. He has lectured at law schools and other venues throughout the country and is the author of 2 books, and his legal scholarship has been published internationally in many prestigious law journals and magazines. He's going to be talking tonight about that book that he is selling back there. If you have not had a chance to read it, I really recommend that you pick up a copy and have him sign it for you, inscribe it for you. They're great Christmas presents. See, I'm a great salesperson. So, yeah, there you go. But it's really, anybody that grew up in this area or loves this area would love this book. It's just a really kind of a love letter for John Voelker and the area as well. This Dissecting Anatomy of Murder, the author, the crime, the novel, and the film was published in 2021. The book was an immediate success, and Gene has since presented and lectured on the subject in a variety of venues. And the book is based in part on his extensive research of John Voelker's journals, related materials housed at Northern Michigan University Archives. And he confessed to me that he's always nervous when he comes up here because he thinks that someone's going to point out that he made a mistake or something about the area. But I don't think he has to worry about that here. So Gene is a native of Detroit, Michigan, and he's been married to his lovely wife, Diana, who's sitting back there for over 38 years, and they are blessed with 4 children and 1 beautiful granddaughter. So please join me in welcoming Gene to Peter White Public Library.
Thank you, Marty, and I'm serious. If you could come around with me and do the introduction, that would be great. But I'm not blocking. Okay, I'm not blocking that. Well, it's great to be here. It's great that you all came out. This is sort of Anatomy of a Murder Central when I visit Marquette and Ishpeming. One little factoid, yesterday was the 70th anniversary of the murder that was the real-life trial that led to the novel, that led to the movie. So, we usually don't celebrate murders as historic occasions, but that's kind of significant, I think. But welcome. I'm going to start out by just showing you the cover of my book. Now, that's the cover of Anatomy of a Murder. That's the movie poster. And you notice the color scheme on the two of those. And then that's Saul Bass's silhouettes that were the title sequence, which was very influential. It's influenced a lot of movies afterwards. So what I did is, you can see I borrowed the color scheme and the silhouette. And I'm a lawyer, so I got a copyright clearance for it, so we're all okay. But that's my book. And first thing I'd like to address is, why did I write this book? I saw the film Anatomy of a Murder when I was in high school. And it had a really profound effect on me. I had always thought maybe I want to go to law school. But then I saw Anatomy of a Murder, and I got the sense that I was seeing something that was authentic, unlike the typical Hollywood fare of courtroom dramas. So my mother was a librarian. I have a great fondness for libraries. And after I saw the movie, I said, can you get me that book? So she brought the book home. I read the novel. And that is one of the things that led me to go to law school, and then to practice law as a prosecutor and defense counsel, at least early in my career. Anatomy of a Murder. How many people have seen the movie, by the way? Yeah, like I say, I'm in Anatomy of a Murder Central. How many have read the novel? Oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. If you've read the novel, you know that it is compelling, right? It's a page turner. But the other aspect of that novel that appeals to me is, I think it's very deep and profound. And the law professor in me and the lawyer in me identified all sorts of legal and ethical and moral and philosophical issues that were raised by the book. And when I speak to law students and groups of lawyers, I concentrate more on that. I'm not going to concentrate a lot on that today, but I'm happy to chat with folks if you want to afterwards about that. And that is the last section of the book, which I'm not going to spend much time with. What I'm going to do is go through the first several parts of the book, and my presentation basically tracks the book, and it's largely chronological. We start out with a biography of the author, John Voelker, the true life homicide, the true life murder trial, the writing and publishing in the novel, and then the filming and the production of the movie. So let's begin talking about John Voelker. Let me ask this, how many people knew or had family members who knew John Voelker? Yeah, this is always very interesting to me, and a bit intimidating, I have to say. He was born in Ishpeming. He was educated first at Northern Michigan University, and then went to the University of Michigan, where he received his undergraduate and his law degree. He practiced law in Chicago and Marquette. Later, I'm going to talk to you about why he started out in Chicago and then later came back to Marquette in Ishpeming to practice law. Okay, you all know where Ishpeming is. But I have this slide here for when I talk to groups in Florida. It's hard to believe they've never heard of Ishpeming. So here it is, and even by today's standards, it's pretty isolated. Imagine what it was like back at the turn of the century when John Voelker was born, or even in the 1950s when the murder took place and the trial took place. Ben Gazzara played Lieutenant Mannion in the movie, and this was the first movie ever filmed entirely on location. And all the cast came up here, they lived here, they spent 3 months here, they became part of the community. I'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later. But to give you a sense of what Ishpeming was at that time, Ben Gazzara, the first day he arrived, he walked around town and he said there were 5 bars on every street and everyone was packed with people drinking. I read a quote in Voelker's notes where he said that Ishpeming had more churches per capita than any city in Michigan, and 5 bars for every church. Yes?
I asked somebody about that when I first moved up here, because every town you go in, and they said it's because of the ethnic diversity, and the Irish don't want to be in the same bar with the Germans or with the whatever, they'd be fighting all the time. So each ethnic group had to have its own bar.
Yeah, and I think there is truth to that, although Voelker will talk about, and I'll talk later about how he spent a lot of time as a child in his father's saloon, and it was there that he picked up a lot of the different dialects. So there had to at least be some intermixing of drinking there, but I think part of the reason there were so many bars too is that this was a mining town, and this was a hard life, and miners needed to drink and blow off steam. So I think that's part of it too. So here is the main street in Ishpeming around the time that Voelker was born, and here it is in 1950 around the time of the movie. And other than the traffic signal and the make of the cars, there's not too much difference, right? And if you've seen the movie, you'll know that after Paul Beegler, Voelker's alter ego, played by Jimmy Stewart, drives into town by the large mining elevators and hoists and everything, he comes down the main street here and then turns to the house on West Barnum Street. This is the Cliff Mine. This was the employer of everyone who lived in Ishpeming and worked in the mines. Ishpeming was not only figuratively but literally built on iron ore mining. The mines extended under the entire city. And in the movie, they used Voelker's true life residence as Jimmy Stewart's residence and law office. And when you see Eve Arden, who played his secretary, and other people walk in and out of the residence, you hear the trains clanging and making noise in the distance. That's because they were constantly moving in and out, taking out the iron ore. And twice a day on like clockwork, on the hour, once in the morning and once in the early evening, they would set off a large explosion in the mine to dislodge rocks so they could take it out. And a couple minutes before these explosions, residents in the town would go over and hold the paintings on the wall or hold the china in the cases because the explosions were that loud. There are thousands of fascinating stories about the life of the folks at that time. One quick digression. I want to talk about Henry Russi. Does anyone recognize that name? He's a Finnish immigrant. He's a miner. He worked in the mine and there was a collapse and he was buried. They finally extricated him. They thought he was dead. He had a crushed skull. While they were putting the toe tag on him outside, they noticed his toe move. So they took him to the local hospital. I can't imagine that medical care was too sophisticated in Ishpeming, Michigan around that time. But he fully recovered. He opened the first gas station in Ishpeming and was later elected mayor. And this is just one of the thousands of fascinating stories I'm sure that are out there if you really start to dig into that. Okay, this is for my folks in Florida. They ask, what's that white stuff? Because they have no idea what that is. I know you all are very familiar with that up here. So Voelker was elected county prosecutor. In fact, he was elected 7 times. He served 14 years as the prosecutor. It was a heavily Republican area, and he was a staunch Democrat. And he claimed he was the first Democrat to be elected there since the Great Flood. He was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court. There's a fascinating story about that. But he was appointed to the Supreme Court just literally months before Anatomy of a Murder was published. So his life before then was trying to scrape by a living and doing a little law practice as long as it didn't interfere too much with his fly fishing. But within the span of a few months, he's on the Michigan Supreme Court, he's a best-selling author, and he's on his way to riches. So you talk about your life pivoting in just a moment. He's the author of 10 books, but none of them, I mean, he was a great writer. I enjoy his books, but none of them approached the commercial success of Anatomy of a Murder. Voelker once said, he had published 2 books before Anatomy of Murder, he once said that his readership could fit into a phone booth. Here's his parents, George and Annie Voelker. Notice her maiden name is Traver. That was the pen name that Voelker took. Traver, first name Robert, for his late brother who was a pilot who died in World War II. It's hard to find 2 people who were more different than these 2. George was a hard-drinking, hard-living guy who had all sorts of jobs but finally settled in as a saloon owner, and he owned a saloon in Ishpeming, very successful, made a very good living, had 3 children by his first wife who then passed away. Annie was much younger, came from down south, was highly educated. She was going to be the town librarian, also a music teacher. And I think that, for many reasons, their marriage was largely one of convenience. Annie was 29 years old at the time, which was a spinster by the standards of those days. And she was looking for someone who could provide financial stability and a good living. And George, on the other hand, was probably not only looking for companionship, but somebody to help raise his 3 sons. Now, they had 4 children between them, 2 boys, a girl, and then John, who's the baby of the family. The second to last child, Margaret, died at a very early age. And, of course, the death of a child is always devastating. It's had a real impact on Annie, who then began to baby George and protect George from, protect John from George, who was not into nurturing parenting at all. I mean, he taught him how to swim by throwing him in a lake. He pushed his brothers down the stairs. But Annie protected John. So here's the Voelker family, and you can see John is the baby of the family, right? And he was the special one, at least in Annie's eyes. Here's the house in West Barnum Street. It's still there. The Voelker family no longer owns it. But if you saw the movie, this would look familiar because, as I said, this is where Jimmy Stewart lived and his office was. The movie that's one example of how authentic the movie was. There's the Carnegie Library. That is literally steps from Voelker's childhood home. This is where Annie worked as a librarian. John split his time between the library and his father's saloon. He was a voracious reader. People said, I'm sure with a little exaggeration, that he'd read every book in the library. Here's his father's saloon. This is very sensitive. Here's his father's saloon where he split his time. And he swept floors, cleaned glasses, learned how to play cribbage, became very good, would gamble, would win money so he could buy a steak because his father didn't want to spend money on that type of food for the kids. And as I said, here's where he picked up his sense of dialogue. His books are rich with the different immigrant cultures and Native Americans who populated the area. This is the Rainbow Bar. This is one of the places where he would frequent for cribbage after he was old enough to get out of his father's saloon. Congress was another one. The Rainbow Bar, though, is pretty interesting because there were no chairs or stools in the bar. Because you didn't go there to sit down, you went there to drink. And if someone were to happen to ask the bartender for something to eat, he'd say, where the hell do you think you are, Burger King? We have got no food here. We drink here. Here's John and Grace later in life. A very interesting story about how John met Grace. John was a third-year law student at the University of Michigan, and he was the head of the dance committee. So to his displeasure, he had to rent a tux and put on a tuxedo. Grace was someone else's date. She was a freshman at the time and several years younger than John. And in his notes, John said the moment he saw Grace, he knew the jig was up. He followed her around the whole day at night like a Doberman pinscher, he said. And then near the end of the dance, a bunch of engineering students came in and started throwing smoke bombs and stink bombs and other things to disrupt the law school dance. Well, John got into it with one of these engineering students, and they tumbled down the stairs, hitting each other. Next morning, John gets up and sees the bulletin board outside of his dorm room. A note is pinned to it that says, Dean Bates wants to see you immediately. He was the dean of the law school. And John thought, I'm going to get expelled. So he goes to Dean Bates' office. He stands in front of the desk. Bates rises up out of his chair, walks around the desk, and extends his hand and says, way to go. Way to get those engineers. And John was so relieved that he later dedicated one of his books to Dean Bates. Here is something I found that he wrote about how he was a stranger in a strange land in urban environments and cities. He missed his native Marquette. And if you read this, first of all, you can see what a good writer he was, right? But the last line there, the city's personality was its utter lack of personality. Yeah, he's talking about Ishpeming. He was in Chicago at the time when he wrote this. So why did he go to Chicago to practice law? Well, Grace moved down to Chicago to help care for a child that her mother had late in life. So if John was going to marry Grace, he had to leave Ishpeming and go down to Chicago. Grace was from a very prominent, wealthy family. Her father was a banker, got John a job as a lawyer. But he never was comfortable in Chicago. He would try to find apartments with trees next to them. But I think the final straw that propelled him to leave Chicago and return to Ishpeming was the death of his son. Voelker's had 3 daughters, and then the baby of the family again was a son, Robert, named after his brother. I got to know the Voelker's daughter and son-in-law and others real well. I had dinner in their home. They took me around the home, and they took me at one point to the back bedroom. And there's something here that really struck a note with me. Here's a picture of John as a child. After his son Robert died, less than a year old, in a Chicago hospital, he had a painting commissioned of Robert. This is hanging in his bedroom. This was the last image he saw every night when he went to bed, and the first image he saw in the morning when he got up. And I think he viewed Robert as the chance for him to be the father that he never had to his son. And it was shortly after that the family moved back to Ishpeming. Grace and the three girls moved back with John. Here he is in court, the place he was probably third most often seen, second in a saloon playing cribbage and drinking bourbon, and first fly fishing. Ran for Congress and was never successful in being elected. Again, it was a very Republican area. He was no politician. Most of his campaign stops were fishing demonstrations. But one story that I thought was humorous about this is Ishpeming at that time had a Baby Day parade, an annual Baby Day parade. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, so the idea there is that grown men would dress up like babies and be pushed in a stroller and wave to the crowds who came to see the grown men dressed like babies. So John thought this is a great campaign opportunity. So he hired a guy to dress up as a baby and get in a stroller, and then when they pushed him down the street, he would toss out these campaign literature, some in English and some in Finnish. Well, you can guess what happened, right? The guy got drunk, didn't show up. But undeterred, John put on the baby costume and had somebody push him, and he tossed the literature out. Here's his Supreme Court portrait. Interesting story on how he got to the Supreme Court. Governor G. Menon Williams, many of you probably remember him, Soapy Williams, was the governor at the time, and there was a vacancy on the Michigan court. And Williams wanted to reinstate the tradition of having one of the justices from the Upper Peninsula. So he formed a panel to interview people, and they called candidates in. Voelker was one of them. And they asked the same question of every candidate. And one of the questions was, why do you want to be a Supreme Court justice? So when they asked Voelker that question, he said, well, to be honest with you, I need the money. That's why he said in his journal he ran for prosecutor. That's why he ran for Congress. Well, this was reported back to Governor Williams, and he was so taken by Voelker's candor that he named Voelker to the court. And it was shortly after Voelker was appointed to the court that Anatomy of a Murder was published, and his whole life changed. Now, he stayed on the court and ran for a second term so he could win and then could keep it in Democrat hands, and Williams could appoint a Democrat to take his place on the court. He was only on the court for about 2 years, but he was very prolific. He wrote over 100 opinions. As a lawyer, I've read a lot of appellate court opinions that is sort of drudgery to get through. He's a novelist writing court opinions. They just kind of leap off the page. So talk about the true life homicide. It occurred in the Lumberjack Tavern. People familiar with the Lumberjack Tavern up in Big Bay? So, as I say, 70 years ago yesterday, Lieutenant Coleman Peterson shot and killed Maurice Mice Chenoweth at the Lumberjack Tavern in Big Bay, Michigan. Peterson's wife, Charlotte, claimed that Chenoweth had raped her earlier that evening. Chenoweth told his friends and his business partner that they had sex, but it was consensual. And Chenoweth was very polarizing. Mrs. Peterson was a polarizing character. And the town was pretty much divided on who they believed. Chenoweth or Mrs. Chenoweth, what he told, obviously he couldn't continue to tell it, he was dead, but the Chenoweth's version or Mrs. Peterson's version. So there's Big Bay. I'm sure you all are familiar with where Big Bay is. It's called the Lumberjack Tavern because there used to be a lot of timber there. It was no longer populated by lumberjacks at that time. Henry Ford had built a processing mill up there where he made the wood for, remember the old Woody station wagons for the sides of the station wagon? And the lumberjack was the spot to go if you wanted to go out and do something at night there. Of course, this was a big deal. This is the Marquette newspaper headline at the time. For two reasons, Voelker almost didn't defend this case. One is he lost the election shortly within a year of the trial. If he had won that election, he would have been prosecuting it rather than defending it. And then when Mrs. Peterson was calling around to try to get an attorney to defend her husband, she couldn't get a hold of John because he was out fishing, predictably. That's a picture of Chenoweth. That's a picture of Peterson, but I got better ones of both of them. Here's Chenoweth. A real interesting character. Former Marine, went to the Michigan State Police, got a height waiver. He was too short by their standards, but one of the reasons he got the waiver is because of his prowess with firearms. He used to have his wife hang up clothes on a clothesline, and then he would shoot the clothespins off as demonstrations for the patrons. And he built gun boxes under the bar where he kept pistols, and he'd do twirling and other types of things. Well, he was kicked out of the Michigan State Police in disgrace. Depending on who you listen to, he was accused of 1 or 2 rapes before the Peterson case, but was never prosecuted, was never even arrested for those. That's Chenoweth. Then you have Mrs. Peterson. That's her dog, George, with the flashlight. More about the dog and the flashlight later. But she was from Texas, where everything is big, right? Big personality, big hair, very flirtatious by any measure, and several years older than her husband, the lieutenant. I believe that she divorced her first husband about a week before she married the lieutenant. So here is Lieutenant Peterson, Mrs. Peterson, and John Voelker, and of course George. And I have the peyote cigar highlighted. I'll talk more about the peyote later, but it's a cigar that Voelker always seemed to have in his hand or chomping in his mouth. This is the trailer that the Petersons lived in. It's in Perkins Park, which is still operating today as a trailer park. It's just down the road and across the street from the Lumberjack Tavern. And what happened is Chenoweth was supposedly giving Mrs. Peterson a ride home, pulled into a dark, secluded area, kicked George, the dog, out of the car, and then, according to Mrs. Peterson, beat her up and then raped her. The prosecution's theory was that Mrs. Peterson had consensual sex with Chenoweth. Then her jealous husband, when she got back to the trailer, beat her up because she had consensual sex. Lieutenant Peterson admitted that he slapped her, but he said he did this to calm her down, and he had her swear that it was a rape on a rosary. He said to calm her down, but of course the prosecution's theory was because he didn't believe her. If you look at the movie, you'll see Jimmy Stewart drive into the park there, and you'll see a tall wooden flagpole. That's still there. This is what was the Big Bay Inn at that time. Now, Voelker set the crime in Thunder Bay, so this was the Thunder Bay Inn. It's since changed its name to the Thunder Bay Inn. Movie was filmed in black and white, but they had painted this pink. And the reason they did is it showed up better on black and white film. And then you see the extension coming forward and to the left. That was built for the movie. But even on an accelerated schedule, they couldn't complete it in time. So the actors were walking, and parts of the floor were just a dirt floor at the time that it was filmed. Henry Ford built this as a place for his executives to vacation when they came and checked out the timber stuff. So there's the lumberjack at that time. So what happens is, after Mrs. Peterson comes home and she's either beaten up or calmed down or whatever, Lieutenant Peterson grabs a German Luger, who he took off a dead German in World War II, hops in his car, drives down the road a little ways to the lumberjack, comes in the side door and begins shooting as he enters. He fired 6 shots total. 5 of them, for sure, hit Chenoweth. There's some question about whether the 6th shot hit him, grazed his neck, or missed him completely. He fired about 3 shots. Chenoweth falls behind the bar, and then he reaches over the bar and empties the final 3 shots into him while he's laying prone. You probably can't see that very well, but that's the bullet that either missed Chenoweth or just nicked his neck and broke a bottle and then the mirror. A story about this, too. First of all, Peterson must have got the jump on Chenoweth. Now, Peterson was no doubt a good shot. He was an Army officer, but Chenoweth had pistols under the bar. Of course, Peterson knew about this because he used to do the demonstrations all the time. So he began firing as he came in the bar, and his aim was true. Well, of course, when he starts shooting, everybody scatters. They run to the ladies' room, men's room, get on the floor, except for one old guy who just sat at his table and continued drinking his drink. And he was interviewed afterwards, and he said the thing that bothered him the most about this was that it ruined a good bottle of top shelf whiskey. So here's Chenoweth behind the bar, dead at the scene, pronounced dead at the scene. When the guy who owns the bar now bought it, he got Chenoweth's pistol as part of the deal. So being an anatomy nerd, I got to know him and talk with him, and he brought the pistol out and let me look at the pistol and take a photograph of the pistol, which I have here. I also have it in the book, but you can see Chenoweth's name etched into the pistol there. So now the trial itself. It began September 15th. It lasted for 8 days. Remember, the murder was on July 31st? So we're talking 6 weeks later the trial began. That would be unheard of today. It was tried in the historic Marquette Courthouse, and the movie was filmed in the historic Marquette Courthouse. Peterson was acquitted based on a defense of temporary insanity. And if you think about the hand that Voelker was dealt as the defense counsel, he didn't have much choice, right? Because Peterson basically committed a public execution of the victim. Certainly couldn't argue alibi. It was too separated in time and distance to even argue for heat of passion. It was an unusual form of the insanity defense because the typical defense is a claim that the defendant couldn't tell right from wrong. But the defense couldn't find a psychiatrist who would say that about Peterson. But they did find an Army psychiatrist who would say that he was acting under an irresistible impulse. In other words, he knew it was wrong, but he couldn't control himself. A very rare version of the insanity defense. You have to go back 50, 60 years or more to see when it was last raised in the state of Michigan. So here's Voelker waving on the steps of the courthouse. Here's what the courthouse looked like at the time. And here's a photo I took of it a couple years ago. More paintings on the wall, a lot of technology retrofitted in, but the same beautiful courthouse. This is the large dome on the. I think it's a beautiful building. Voelker was was not at all a fan of the architecture and said so, not only in his books but in his journals. So let me see. So here's the prosecution team. Irving Beatty, who was played by George C. Scott in the movie, and then the local prosecutor up there, Ed Thomas, who had defeated Voelker in the election. Voelker doesn't say unkind things about a lot of people in his journals, but he tore in to Thomas. And this was largely because he and Thomas, at least according to Voelker in the journals, had reached an agreement that there would be certain limitations on how they would campaign. And then, predictably, a few days before the election, Voelker goes off and fishes. And then Thomas starts breaking all of those agreements, and he wins by just a handful of votes. So things could have been very different if the election had gone the other way. Now, Thomas was a bit of a celebrity. He was a varsity basketball player at the University of Michigan, and by all accounts, certainly not an experienced lawyer, probably not a very good lawyer, at least not in Voelker's class as a trial lawyer, but he knew his limitations. So he wrote the Attorney General and said, I need help. And that's when they sent up Irving Beatty. During the trial, Voelker is kind of a larger-than-life presence. He refers to Beatty as the little man from Lansing. And at one point, Beatty objects and says, I'm not from Lansing, I'm from a city smaller than Ishpeming. So one of the things that's interesting is when you watch the movie and you see the dialogue in the trial, I would say roughly 90% of that is taken verbatim or almost verbatim from the record of trial. And some of the things you say, well, that couldn't have happened. You know, like, I'm going to punch you out to Lake Superior. That's right in the record of trial. Here's the jury. I have the arrow pointed to Max Muley. It was 11 men, 1 woman. You see a second woman there. She was an alternate. Muley was by far the youngest juror, and he provided a very helpful oral history years later when the other jurors had passed away. Everybody on the jury knew John Voelker. Most called him Johnny. Everybody on the jury knew the prosecutor, Thomas. Everybody on the jury knew Chenoweth. Many people on the jury knew the Petersons. Everyone on the jury knew the star prosecution witness who was Chenoweth's partner, something you would never see today. And it's fascinating to me, as a former trial attorney, that no jurors were challenged. Both the prosecution and the defense were satisfied with this. There was no motion for a change of venue. I also believe that not only did the defendant know he wasn't insane, and Voelker knew he wasn't insane, all the jurors knew that he wasn't insane. This was a case of jury nullification, pure and simple, and insanity was, in Voelker's words, the peg that they could hang the nullification verdict on. Now, I have the record of trial. I've read it, of course, a lot. I have excerpts in the book. But unfortunately, for some reason, the closing arguments were never captured in the record of trial. So, right, I mean, wouldn't you love to be able to read the closing argument? Because Beatty was a very good attorney, and of course, Voelker was Voelker. In the notes, when I go through the journals, I see some of the earlier drafts of some of the argument. This is one of them, but it was never preserved, the closing argument, which is a real shame. Okay, so now let's talk about the writing of the novel. It took 3 years for Voelker to write it. He had several false starts. The first time he was going to be the prosecutor, a guy named Sinclair, and then eventually decided to be the defense counsel. One of the reasons it took so long is that he only wrote when it wasn't fishing season. The first draft he completed was about 3 times too long for a novel. And he sent it to publishers, and they say, well, it's just well written, but we can't publish this. So he knew an editor from one of his earlier books who came in and they cut it down to about half. It was still way longer than novels were at that time. That's why it sold for $4.95 a copy rather than $3.95 a copy. So here is a page of the manuscript that Voelker worked on. This was a day before keyboards and computers and all of that. So he would handwrite a chapter and then give it to his secretary to type. She would type it and give it back to him, and then he would have a green, a blue, and a red pen, and he would go through and edit it and give it back to her. She'd retype, and this would happen, 6, 7 times. In fact, Voelker once said that his secretary was the first person to translate his novel into English. And I've learned that he locked his manuscript in a safe every night. And I thought originally, well, he was afraid somebody was going to steal it. But that wasn't it at all. Remember, there's no storage on a hard drive or cloud storage or anything. He was afraid it was going to be destroyed in a fire. And that's why he locked it in a safe. So it's a bestseller. In fact, it's an all-time record-setting bestseller. Here you see a bestseller list with it, number 1. 65 weeks on the bestseller list. At that time, a record, it still may be a record. I believe it is still a record, 29 weeks at number 1. It's a very well-reviewed book because I say not only is it compelling and entertaining, but it's very deep. And let me just share one review with you. Out of that jungle drama, Robert Traver has fastened this fascinating analysis of a man who has taken the life of another. This is no mere courtroom novel, but an enormously detailed and endlessly absorbing account of what a brilliant criminal lawyer thought and did from the moment he first learned of the slaying and accepted the defense to that moment, months later, that the jury re-entered the courtroom to reveal the verdict. But it is still more, for it is an acutely reasoned exposition of the law as social catharsis, as the only thing that keeps society from becoming a snarling jungle. The author has invested the entire drama with dignity, decency, honesty, and emotional voltage. Now that's a review. If any of you are moved to write a review on Amazon of my book, I know it'd be too much of a stretch to write something like this, but a kind word would be appreciated. So Voelker's a celebrity now. He's on the cover of Life magazine. He appeared on the old Johnny Carson show. That didn't go over very well. He was kind of crude and sexist in his appearance. And he made his celebrity tour and then, of course, returned to Ishpeming. Yeah, I think he just did that for the photo because he had the parody all the time. Double Life Exposed. Remember, he used a pen name. He said he started using a pen name because he didn't want the voters to think when he was a prosecutor that he was fooling around on their time. And there might be some truth to that, but he was also a very private person. He used a pen name even as a young man before he was a prosecutor. So now the film, box office smash and critical success, lots of awards, lots and lots of nominations, not a lot of Academy Awards. Ben-Hur came out the same year, and that pretty much swept the Academy Awards. I read in the Voelker's journal at one point he said that Anatomy lost out to Charlton Heston's Pecs. So that was his explanation. First Hollywood movie, as I said, ever shot on location. Produced and directed by Otto Preminger. You're familiar with Otto Preminger? You know, one of the finest directors we've had. If you see the movie Stalag 17, he plays the commandant. That's Otto Preminger. All-star cast, and I'll talk a little bit about the cast as I move on here. So this is a publicity picture where you see everyone in the courtroom. And here's Voelker, Jimmy Stewart, his alter ego, the defense counsel, Paul Beegler, George C. Scott, who plays Claude Dancer, the prosecutor, And then Brooks West, who plays the local prosecutor, married in real life to Eve Arden, who plays Buegler's secretary. That's Lee Remick, who played Laura Mannion. And there's Preminger in the background there. And of course, this is an all-star cast, but the cast was also very deep. As I said, Eve Arden was in the cast. There's Ben Gazzara. It's his first role in a movie. And then there's Murray Hamilton. Do you know who Murray Hamilton was?
Mr. Robinson.
Pardon me?
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Robinson. Also, the movie Jaws. He's the mayor in Jaws. So here is Preminger and Voelker. They became very good friends. In fact, Preminger's next movie was Exodus, and he invited Voelker and his wife and Welsh, who played the judge, and his wife to come to Israel, and they stayed with him for a while he filmed the movie. Here you see Preminger in the middle with Voelker on one side and Jimmy Stewart on the other. Think he looks like John Wayne? The first time Jimmy Stewart saw him, he said, "You look like John Wayne." And of course, Grace, people were saying that for years, and Grace loved that her husband looked like John Wayne. If you don't believe me, that's pretty close, isn't it? Voelker wanted John Wayne to play Paul Buegler, but Preminger very wisely went after Jimmy Stewart, who, for my money, is just absolutely great in the role. I think it's his finest performance. Now, this was very edgy subject matter, very controversial subject matter. It was a departure from Stewart to do this. It was his last Academy Award nomination. His father was so upset by the subject matter of the film that he urged people not to see it. So now to the parody, or as Voelker's, as Buegler's partner Parnell calls it, the Italian stinkweed. Jimmy Stewart, by all accounts, was a very professional actor. He was always on time. He studied all his lines at night. He was always ready. He only lost his temper once during the filming of the movie. And that was one of the scenes where he's trying to light the parody while he's talking, and he can't get the thing lit. And he finally just explodes. And Preminger calls time out, and they take a few hours to calm everybody down. So here's a scene of Voelker afterwards showing him how to light the parody. George C. Scott played Claude Dancer. Of course, he's probably most famous for Patton. He was largely a stage actor before this. He's from Detroit, kind of unknown in the movies, and again, I think he's brilliant. And then think about it. You've got Jimmy Stewart and George C. Scott going at each other in court, right? So who is the judge who's going to ride herd on these two? You need somebody with a lot of gravitas, right? And Preminger originally considered Spencer Tracy and Burl Ives, but he finally settled on Joseph Welch. You might not recognize that name, but Joseph Welch was the lawyer at the McCarthy hearings who basically dressed down Senator McCarthy. It was known as the beginning of the end of McCarthyism. And he was a celebrity. These were televised hearings. He was probably the most famous lawyer in the country at that time. He appeared on the cover of Life and was... So Preminger, he's two things, right? He's a director, but he's also a producer, and he wants to make money. And he says, this guy is going to attract people to the movie. Plus, he's a real judge. I think he can ride herd on these two. He was the highest paid actor in the movie. Higher paid than Jimmy Stewart. And he had one other condition to do the movie. He was recently married. His wife had to appear in the movie. So if you look at the jury in the courtroom scenes, there's a woman in a polka dot dress in the front row over to the side. That's his wife. Lee Remick, of course, played Laura Mannion. She was not Preminger's first choice. Preminger's first choice was Lana Turner. And they had reached an agreement where Turner was going to do it. But then Turner came back and insisted that she wasn't going to wear the costumes that had been prepared for the movie. She wanted her designer to design costumes for her. And Preminger says an army wife is not going to have designer clothes, so he cut ties with Turner. Now, he had earlier offered Lee Remick the second lead in the movie, Mary Pallant. Remick had only been in one movie, A Face in the Crowd, and Preminger was very taken by her in that movie. It was pretty gutsy. She turned it down. But when Turner bowed out, Preminger met with Remick again and offered her the lead, and she immediately accepted. In fact, when she had lunch with Preminger and he offered her to her, she was 8 months pregnant at the time, and she and her infant child and her nanny were on the set during the filming of the movie. It's Catherine Crosby, who plays Mary Pallant. I have the picture here because you see Voelker teaching her how to tie a fishing fly. And he took the entire cast fishing. They really became part of the community. They visited hospitals. They did charitable work. Duke Ellington played at fraternity and sorority dances. Arthur O'Connell bought carpeting for the Catholic Church. Jimmy Stewart at one point was presented with a pasty, and he didn't know what to do with it. Yeah. So, yeah. Duke Ellington wrote the score. He has an uncredited appearance as Pie Eye. First jazz score to ever win an Academy Award. First person to win an Academy Award for a score who was African American. And he became, the music is very iconic, just like the title graphics and everything else about the movie. He became very good friends with Voelker. Voelker fashioned himself as a pianist, and he could plunk out tunes. Ironically, his mother never taught him. His father wouldn't let her. His piano was for sissies and girls. So Voelker was self-taught on the piano, and his daughter told me a really charming story. One evening, Duke Ellington was over at the Voelker's house for dinner, and after dinner, Voelker played a tune on the piano for Duke Ellington. And then he asked Duke Ellington if he would play. So Ellington gets to the piano, he's getting ready to play, and Voelker says, "Look, I just got this new tape recorder. Do you mind if I record you?" And Ellington said, "No, my music contract, my record contract doesn't allow that. So please, I won't share it with anyone." So Ellington says, "Okay, go ahead." So he starts playing, and Voelker stops him and says, "I got to fix this." This goes on about 5 or 6 times. Finally, Voelker says, "Okay, I got it." And Ellington played. He never figured out how to operate the tape recorder. It was never recorded, but he just got tired of interrupting Ellington. Here's where the dance hall scene is, where Ellington appears at Mount Shasta near Michigami. By the way, all the folks you see dancing in there were Northern Michigan University students, except for one girl, Voelker's youngest daughter, who was in high school at the time. Okay, here's the courtroom. Why am I showing you this photograph of the courtroom? You can check this out. You go to the courthouse. You go to the marble stairs here. Let me see if I can just do the one arrow. And you can still see the chips and the marks from when they moved the filming equipment up into the courtroom to film the movie. And of course, Voelker's portrait appears there. Of course, it wasn't there at the time. And then why am I showing you the men's room door? Well, in the movie, they took off the men's room sign and they put law library on that. So when they walked into the law library, they were really walking into a men's room. The law library at the courthouse was too small for filming, so those scenes were filmed in the Carnegie Library in Ishpeming, the library scenes. So the premiere was in Detroit, but Voelker did a soft opening in Marquette and in Ishpeming. Here's the Butler Theater in Ishpeming, and donated all of the proceeds to charities there. In fact, to Preminger's credit, he insisted that extras in the movie be paid $10 a day, which was the rate that they got in Hollywood, even though he could have got people for a fraction of that price or even free in Michigan. And it was a real boon to the economy. In fact, Anatomy of a Murder was named Michigan's Product of the Year in 1959. So here is the big premiere in Detroit, and you can see Preminger and Remick and Voelker, and the governor was there. As I said, this was very edgy. By today's standards, like when everybody giggles when you say the word panties, it seems so, outdated. But this was really edgy at the time. It's part of what attracted Preminger to it. Part of it was his father was a lawyer. He had studied law for a while. But the movie was banned in Chicago, in Boston for a while. Here is the wall in the basement of what is now Globe Printing in Ishpeming. At that time, it was sort of a restaurant gathering place. This is where the cast went every evening. And they would gamble. Ellington would play the piano. They would do impromptu plays. And near the end of the filming, Eve Arden said, everybody's got to sign this wall or you won't get paid. So all of the cast and the principal crew signed the wall. You see Saul Bass did his silhouette in the middle of it. And then they painted over the signatures and then put a coating on it to preserve it. Now, this isn't generally open to the public, but, if you go to Globe Publishing and ask to see it, they'll take you downstairs. Voelker called it the Ishpeming Club 21, where they all gathered. And this gives you an idea how large it is. And you can see she's removing blankets and curtains. That's there to protect the wall from being damaged from all the printing that's done down there. So, with his money, besides building a new home, he purchased a lumber camp that had this cabin on it. He renamed it Uncle Tom's, and this is his famous cabin that he refers to. Here's a picture of Voelker there. The family graciously took me out there, let me tour it. It's been preserved in the state that it was at the time. In the book, there are photos of the interior of the cabin, so you can see what they're like. Here's a photo I took of Frenchman's Pond, named the second most famous pond in North America behind Walden Pond. Here is Voelker with his first. He had 2 fishing cars. This one was buckshot. What he would do is when he left old, broken, rusted out mufflers along the trail to his cabin to try to dissuade people from driving there. And he always carried a rake in his vehicle where he would rake tire tracks so that people couldn't find his secret place. Here he is later in life there. And of course, in his element, fishing. As I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, no time really, talking about the commentary and reflection section of the book. These are the chapters there, and I think there's a lot of important material there, and I'd be happy to discuss this with anyone afterwards if you would like. I want to close with 2 things. One, if you've seen the movie, you know this is the last image in the movie, right? Voelker and his partner drive out to get paid by the Petersons because they had only given him like $75, but signed a promissory note. And they get out there and the Petersons are gone. And the caretaker of the park hands Jimmy Stewart a note, an envelope. He opens it up, and it's from Lieutenant Peterson. He says, "Sorry, but we were possessed by an irresistible impulse to leave." Okay. And then Stewart picks up this broken high-heel shoe. There's an exchange about poetic justice, which I think is a lot of what this novel and movie talk about. And then he hangs the shoe on the can, and that's the last still shot. To give you an idea how authentic the movie is, Voelker drove out there. He was handed the same note, but the shoe was already hanging on the can. He didn't have to pick it up and put it on the can. The final thing I want to show you is an entry in his journal that I came across when I was doing research for this book. And I think it really captures Voelker. I also tell you, as someone who was trying to write a biographical study, it sort of literally knocked me back in my chair when I read it. And he wrote this before he was famous at all. And here's what he wrote. Every man, every person leaves the seeds of an absorbing biography. Things that would attract no notice whatsoever if the subject remained obscure take on a vast significance if he achieves some sort of special fame. Scholars will dig and vie to find them. This is my journal. Many obscure souls write journals or whatnot. When they die, it is ordinarily used to start a fire. But if he becomes famous or notorious, the poor scribblings will be saved and preserved and quoted and misquoted, and terrible is the significance that will be allowed to the most insane device. I have a notion to become famous just to prove the point. But even if I could, I should hesitate to forsake the joys of anonymity and the solid animal comfort of obscurity. Must do an essay about that someday. That is quintessential Voelker. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk. My lovely wife will do all the hard stuff with credit card, cash, or check. The book is $30, and I'm happy to sign it. If you prefer not to have it signed, I won't sign it. I'll be happy to inscribe it. But I thank you all for your attention, and I don't know if you want me to take questions from the group. I don't want to hold people up, however you prefer to do it.
You want to ask some questions? I think we have a couple minutes if you want.
Yes, ma'am.
Forgive me if this is in the book, but why exactly was Lieutenant Peterson and his wife in that area?
Okay, the Army was doing artillery training out by the lighthouse near Big Bay. They were shooting the shells off into Lake Superior. So he was there doing training. And sometimes people ask, well, how could he just leave? He was in the Army. The unit had already left. He was behind for the trial. So that's why he was able to leave as soon as the trial was over. Yes?
What was the name of the landmark when
The Landmark Hotel? It was still called the Landmark, I believe. Northland? Was it the Northland? This is the one right here in Marquette?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's the one where most of the crew stayed. Most of the principal cast and the director stayed at the Mather Inn in Ishpeming, which I believe is now apartments or condos or something like that. You know, a lot of great story. You can imagine, what would it be today? Tom Cruise, George Clooney, you know, coming to a small little town to film a movie. I don't know how many people I've talked to who were in high school at the time, guys who tried to get in to the Mather Inn so they could see Lee Remick and meet Lee Remick, and spent 8 hours in jail before their father was called to come and pick them up and take them home. There's one story of a crowd gathering around Catherine Crosby while she did laundry. But people took trains from Wisconsin and northern Michigan just to try to get a reservation to eat at the Mather while the celebrities were eating there.
they took Milwaukee Road out?
Yeah. In fact, that's how the cast came up, because there was no Mackinac Bridge at that time.
Do you know, and what year was it? Did it open in Marquette?
56. I was 3 years old.
Did the movie...
56.
Was it brought? Yes, when it was in the theater.
Okay, the premiere was in 59.
You know, his oldest brother, Paul, attended.
I don't know. I don't know that. I will tell you a real quick story, if I can, about Voelker and the Mackinac Bridge. Voelker hated the idea of the Mackinac Bridge. He didn't want people coming to the Upper Peninsula. And he was asked if he would serve on this committee to build the bridge. And he said, no, but I'd be happy to serve on a committee to blow up the bridge. However, I want to wait till all the ferries are decommissioned before I blow the bridge up. Yes?
The verdict of the jury, was that because Voelker was so impressive, or because the jury didn't like?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. One is Voelker was an impressive trial advocate. And he was well known to all of the jurors. But based on what jurors said at the time and then the oral history that I got from that juror, for a lot of the jurors, they either thought that she had consensual sex or that it really didn't matter. But Peterson was justified going out and shooting a man who had sex with his wife, and then went around bragging about it at the bar. And in fact, that little excerpt that I had up earlier of Voelker's closing argument, a draft of it, he talks about it being natural law that a man can go and avenge his wife being violated by somebody else. The mistake she made, he says in there, was trusting this wolf. And there's a scene in the movie where they go through what's a wolf and all of that. That's right from the record of trial. The Petersons were friends with the Chenoweths. Chenoweth was married in real life. And they had had dinner together. The Chenoweths had invited them over for, to have dinner. And at one point, Mrs. Peterson, this is in the Army's investigation, Mrs. Peterson testifies that she told her husband, "Well, you sure picked a fine friend in Mike." Yes?
Is there anything known about the Petersons after they got out of Dodge?
Okay, I can tell you what I know, and it's not a whole lot. They were divorced shortly thereafter. Mrs. Peterson returned to Texas and remarried. If you go online and look it up, it says that Lieutenant Peterson died in a plane crash. But at an earlier presentation I gave, there was a lawyer there who had done a lot of research on Ancestry.com who showed me his research. He's going to email it to me, where it says that Lieutenant Peterson did not die in a plane crash. He lived until the 1970s. He retired from the Army. But one of the things that I thought was funny is the entry on the, I don't know if it was Amazon or 23andMe or whatever was used, the entry, you know how they say like tailor or lawyer or plumber or something, it said murder, which technically isn't true because he was acquitted, right? Yes?
John was very generous in sharing that cabin with friends. He'd have parties out there.
Yes.
And mix his favorite drink
Yes.
for everybody. Right now I'm blanking on what it was.
Whiskey sour.
Yeah.
No. Old-fashioned, I'm sorry, old-fashioned. In fact, I have the recipe for his old-fashioned in the book. Yes, somebody gave it to me. So his recipe, the only place you'll find it, unless you write that great review, and no. But the only place you'll find it's in the book. Yes?
A young man that was here in the wheelchair that just left, and it said he poured coffee for Lee Remick at a restaurant when he was a teenager, and it was the slowest.
Yeah, I have a friend who was the editor of this book who knew Voelker. My friend was a young man at the time, but he has a tin cup that Voelker gave him. And I asked, what's the significance of the tin cup? And he said that when they were up at Big Bay, he took Lee Remick on a Jeep ride into the woods with a bottle of bourbon and 2 tin cups where they drank their bourbon. So, he was starstruck, and of course she was a beautiful woman and famous.
You know, they talked about the bars being packed in instrument. Well, back in those days, the mining company would pay the guys at the mine, and I'll go to the bars afterwards to cash their checks.
Uh-huh.
So when he started sending the checks home, the wives were amazed how much money the guy was making,
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, in my day, I would see it in military towns outside of post because soldiers used to get paid in cash, and they would take that, you know, the story of the drunken sailor, spending money like a drunken sailor and all that. They go right out to the bars. And yes.
I'm sharing things, but my dad and John became very good friends. They had same intellectual interests when we moved up here. And he and my dad had pictures taken together, and just the other day, Woody, his
Yeah, I
son-in-law,
know.
gave me a copy of one of the pictures of John and my
Oh,
dad
that's wonderful.
framed. I'm just thrilled.
Yeah, yeah. Woody was the guy who took me out to the cabin there and showed me around the cabin.
So what do you think of the cabin?
Oh, it's great. It's great. I have to say that I'm very grateful that the family trusted me with this unrestricted access to his files. And it's a very intimate experience. Picture reading somebody else's diary. And that's what it was. So it was a very interesting experience. But I think that they trusted me to be fair, and I believe I was fair in the way I wrote the book, and I'm grateful to them for that.
Do you keep a diary?
No. No, I'm afraid my wife will find it. You know, by the way, we're on a 3-week driving tour. And we're about a week into it, we're still talking to each other. So that's a really good sign, yeah.
All right. Okay, got one more.
Yes?
How long did you teach at NMU?
Did he teach at NMU? I don't know that he taught at NMU. He may have been an adjunct professor for a time, but I don't.
Yeah. I called him, but he was on break and wasn't in his office, but I called him in 1984.
So he must have done that later in life then as an adjunct professor. I know he was a columnist for the Detroit News, and he did other things later in life. In fact, he was driving back from the library in NMU when he suffered his heart attack and died. Yeah. Well,
Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, very good Christmas presents, I'm telling you.
Thank you. And if you could just remember to give me the flash drive, it's